to Jesus Christ, and welcome to this week's episode of God with Us Live. Every week, we're joined by men and women, monastics, clergy, and laity, exploring exciting and inspiring ways to live our Eastern Catholic faith today. Your host is Father Deacon Nick Medelsky, a husband, father, and deacon of the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy of St. Nicholas. And now, here's Father Deacon Nick.
Hello once again, God with Us Live listeners. Father Deacon Nick Medelsky, excited as always to be here with you to find out more about our beautiful Eastern Catholic churches. Now, if you've done any kind of research on Eastern Catholic churches or even interacted in some online forum in Facebook, you may recognize the name of my guest, Father Deacon Anthony Dragani. I first came across his name actually back in the olden days of the internet. I believe we still had dial-up at the time, going to the EWTN question and answers forum back when Father Deacon Anthony was just Anthony at the time, answering questions from people about Eastern Catholicism there. And I'm not going to take away all of your thunder by giving you a lengthy biography at the start. I think better to ask the man himself. So, Father Deacon Anthony, welcome to the show. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, thank you, Father Deacon. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. A bit about myself. So I am a Ukrainian Greek Catholic deacon. I serve 2 parishes in central Pennsylvania. I'm part of the Eparchy of St. Josephat, which is based out of Parma, Ohio. And I'm also a college professor. I teach theology at a small Catholic college called Mount Aloysius, also in central Pennsylvania. I've been doing that for almost 20 years now. And I'm also a husband and a father with 2 beautiful daughters.
Now, I understand that just like myself, you were not raised Ukrainian Catholic. So could you kind of tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the Eastern Catholic churches and became Ukrainian Catholic? Not just that, right? You're pretty, just like I tell people, I'm pretty set at this point. When you're ordained clergy of a church, it's kind of a good indication that you've been hook, line, and sinkered into it. So, what first got you started into the Ukrainian Catholic Church?
Well, I was raised Roman Catholic, but growing up, I had many neighbors and friends who were Eastern Catholic. Where I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, there are a lot of Eastern Catholic churches. And my next door neighbor as a boy was Ruthenian Byzantine Catholic, and we had a wonderful family, and he became one of my best friends. And sometimes I would stay over at his house on Saturday evenings and go to church with him on Sunday mornings. And during that period, I really grew to love and fall in love with the Divine Liturgy. My first experience, though, was before that. When I was maybe 4 or 5, my parents took me to a Ruthenian Byzantine Catholic wedding. And I remember being mystified by the whole experience. The crowns, the icons, the incense. It was like nothing I had seen before. Now, I didn't understand it, but it spoke to me. There was something mysterious about it, and I wanted to know more. So growing up, again, Roman Catholic with a wonderful formation, wonderful parish, wonderful Catholic school that I attended, I still felt this draw towards the mystery of the Divine Liturgy. I'd even dream about it at night sometimes. So when I was in my late teens, probably about 18, 19, I started attending Eastern Catholic parishes more regularly. And around that time, I got a really good spiritual director who introduced me to the Philokalia, the Way of a Pilgrim, the Jesus Prayer. And I found myself drawn largely towards the spirituality of the East. So when I was 21, I decided to officially make the change, and I became Eastern Catholic. I became Eastern Catholic through the wonderful Ruthenian Greek Catholic Church, which I love tremendously. What happened was later on, I got married. My wife was raised Eastern Catholic. She's of Ukrainian, Rusin, Hungarian, Polish ancestry. I'm Italian, but I'm an honorary Slav at this point.
Right.
But my wife and I, we moved to a town where the nearest Eastern Catholic church was Ukrainian. And it was only 5 minutes away from our house. So we went there and we just felt, immediately like we belonged to that parish. It was different than the music we're used to, but otherwise more or less identical for the most part. So whether it was Ukrainian or Ruthenian didn't matter as much to us as it was a beautiful expression of the Byzantine tradition, which we were very much in love with. So we joined that parish. And then after being a parishioner there for a number of years, I eventually pursued the diaconate, at which point I canonically transferred to the Ukrainian Catholic Church.
Gotcha. And you mentioned the diaconate there, and I always love hearing vocation stories. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yours into the diaconate.
Sure. So growing up, I always felt drawn towards some sort of service at the altar. I remember serving as an altar boy at my Roman Catholic parish as a child, and I loved it. I loved being at the altar. I loved helping the priest. I was a terrible altar boy, though. I had really bad ADHD. I missed every cue. But the priests were always patient with me, and at a certain point, that parish got a deacon. Now, this deacon was the first permanent deacon I'd ever encountered. As a matter of fact, I never even knew of deacons who were not on their way to becoming priests before that. In my mind, I always thought deacon meant seminarian because every deacon I encountered was about to be ordained a priest.
Right.
So the way this fellow ended up in our area, at that time, that particular Roman Catholic diocese had no deacons, but he was ordained a deacon in Texas, but his job transferred him to Pennsylvania. And I remember when he first came, people didn't know what to make of him. They weren't sure what to call him, what he was.
Right.
But I saw what he did, and I saw the impact of his ministry. He was a powerful preacher. He'd actually been raised Baptist and had become Catholic later in life. And, I could see myself doing something like that. So that got the idea of deacon in the back of my mind. Later on, when I became Eastern Catholic, I found myself in love with the liturgy, as I mentioned. And I remember the first time I attended a divine liturgy with a deacon, how different it was. When I first experienced the divine liturgy with a deacon, the liturgy seemed to flow very differently in a way that was better and in a way that made more sense to me. And I remember thinking, man, the divine liturgy with a deacon is a whole different experience in many ways. And I thought to myself, every parish should have a deacon. And if you look at the actual text of the divine liturgy, it's presumed that there will always be a deacon. I mean, that's the way it's written, deacon, priest. But the reality is most parishes don't have deacons. And I thought to myself, I would love to be a deacon if for no other reason than to make sure that this important role is carried out during the liturgy.
Right.
Yeah. So it was in the back of my mind for many, many years. But the truth of the matter is, Father Deacon, I was never going to act on it. I was never going to pursue it because there was always something in the way in my mind. For a long time, I had to finish a doctorate, had to find a job. Then I had to work on, getting promoted to associate professor and then promotion to full professor. And there was always something going on, a child on the way. There was never a good time. And the truth is, I was always pushing it off. And then one night, it was only maybe a month or so after our youngest child was born, we were laying in bed. And my wife leaned over to me and said, I think you should become a deacon. And she knew it was on my mind, but she also knew I was never going to do anything about it. And I said to her, oh, you mean when the kids are grown up? And she said, no, now. How about tomorrow you make some phone calls and figure out what you would do to apply to become a deacon?
Wow.
So I wasn't sure what to do, but at that time I had a friend who had been a deacon for many years. At the time he was a deacon, now he's a priest, Father Daniel Dozier, who you know very well. So I called up Father Daniel and I said to him, hey, my wife is encouraging me to apply for the diaconate. Do you know how I'd go about doing that for the eparchy of St. Josaphat? And he said, and at the time he was serving in a different eparchy, but he said, well, as it happens, right now I'm in the car and I'm driving to see the director of deacon formation for your eparchy.
Wow.
Let me talk to him for you. Like, okay. Then a few days later, Father Daniel called me back and said, they're starting a new class of deacon formation. They want you to apply. And as a matter of fact, there's a residency, several weeks away. They want you to apply and come to the residency.
Oh.
All right. So it literally just fell into place. It fell into place. And
Wow.
once I got into formation, it just felt right. I felt that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, and all of my doubts kind of melted away.
Wow. Wow. That's beautiful to hear, and just how, a great testament to how if God wants you, He's going to get you, right? He's
Absolutely.
calling you to the diaconate and
And
speaking
I
through
have to give
different people.
my wife Vanessa, I have to give her endless credit, because if she hadn't given me the push that I needed, I would still be toying with the idea right now.
Right. Well,
I wouldn't have done it.
and all of us really owe your diakonissa a debt of gratitude for that.
Well, thank
um,
you.
and so well, one of the other things that you've also been involved with, and kind of what part of the reason that I've asked you to come on with us today is that you're very great at giving. Um, how do I want to say it? Succinct and very clear explanations of different aspects of Eastern Catholic spirituality, ecclesiology, theology, things like that. As I mentioned, back, a long time ago when I was in high school, so that's like 20 years ago, writing to you on the forums on EWTN, back when you were with them, doing the question and answer there. I found out a lot from you. And also, the years have gone on, active in the forums on Facebook, but you also put together a website that I constantly refer people to who ask me questions when we get an email at the parish. Hey, I want to find out more about Eastern Catholicism. It's really easy to shoot them over to your website. Could you talk a little bit about kind of what went into putting that together, how that idea kind of came together, and just tell us a little bit about the website itself, I suppose.
Certainly. So, as you mentioned, it began with me answering questions for EWTN. At the time, EWTN had a series of Q&A forums where people could, go and submit questions, and experts would answer them. And at the time, I was working as an expert, as a volunteer, as an expert for EWTN, answering these questions. And by the way, I have to give a shout out to my friends at EWTN, especially like Father Deacon Robert Klesko. And I was just there a few weeks ago, and I was visiting with Colin Donovan,
Right.
who's the VP for theology, and he was the one who actually brought me in to be the expert back in the day.
Mm.
And yeah, I recall you did ask me questions during that period. My wife used to read that forum too before she even met me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but it was a great experience. I answered a lot of questions, but in time, I could no longer continue with it because I became way too busy with my job.
Mm.
And later on, they shut down those forums altogether.
Mhm.
But a friend of mine encouraged me to take some of the answers I had written there and put them somewhere else where they would remain. So over a period of a few days, I went through all my old answers on the EWTN forum, copied the best of them,
Mm.
and then restructured them into a website.
Wow.
And that's really where my website's format came from. It was originally the stuff I had written for EWTN, but over the years I've added to it. So probably the main draw on the website is the Eastern Catholic FAQ. And I have other things on there as well, articles I've written, and now I have links to many videos that I've done. The website, though, at the moment is a little bit outdated. I need to do some updating on it. I'm putting that off at the moment because I'm finishing another project, which is related to the website. So about a year and a half ago, I was at a retreat, and the director of the retreat, the priest, came up to me and said to me that there was a need, in his opinion, for a substantive, longer book on Eastern Catholicism. There's some really good introductions out there. Like there's a short introduction written by Father Daniel. There's another older one by Father Appleyard.
Mm-hmm.
But this priest felt that we needed something a little bit longer for those who want to go into greater depth. And he kind of used the example of the Orthodox Church by Callisto Swear, which is a favorite of
Okay,
mine.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I know over the years, many people have come to Eastern Catholic parishes, wanted something more to read, and people would suggest the Orthodox Church by Callisto Swear. And it's a terrific book, but I've known people who've read it and then became Orthodox after reading it.
Right.
So this priest felt we needed something similar that would serve the same purpose, but from an Eastern Catholic perspective, and he encouraged me to write it. So the idea kind of stuck with me, and I felt compelled to work on it, and I kind of dove full force into that project. And I've been working on that book for over a year now, but it's almost done. I'm currently writing up the last chapter, and I'm using some of the material I wrote for the website. I'm incorporating some of that into it, but a lot of it's new material as well. So it's all kind of coming together, and I hope that there'll be a resource in book format soon that people can give to others and recommend, which will hopefully answer a lot of questions.
Very cool. Very cool. I look forward to that because, like you said, we don't have kind of a counterpart to that, to the Orthodox churches by Callistus Ware, which is, like you mentioned, great book. We read it as part of our formation for the diaconate. But like you said, there's also the potential pitfall there that people are like, well, heck, this Orthodox church sounds great. I'll go see what they have on offer instead of you guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, it's fine, that as long as people are growing closer to Christ and things like that. But in the end, right, we are Eastern Catholic for a reason, and we would like people to join us, right? So that is,
and that's one of the things I address in the book is why be Eastern Catholic when it's so much easier in some cases to simply be Orthodox or to be Roman Catholic? What's the purpose of being Eastern Catholic? Where do we fit in?
And that's actually part of what we're going to be talking about in the second half of the interview. There was a document recently published by a group at the Vatican concerning the role of the Pope and different aspects of that, which kind of plays into part of the reason, how Eastern Catholics are different from Eastern Orthodox, but how there may be a path forward. But I don't want to talk about it too much before the break. We'll go ahead and take a break so we can hear about our Saint of the Week, and we'll be right back here on God With Us Live. Stay tuned.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Scenes with the Saints. Do you know which saint became invisible? Saint Ianikius the Great was born to a pious peasant family in Bithynia, which is modern-day northern Turkey. As soon as he was old enough, Ianikios was put in charge of herding the family's cattle, which was his family's only source of income. He would often sneak off from his responsibilities to spend time in secluded prayer, but before he left, he would always make the sign of the cross over the herd to protect it. Even though he spent many hours in prayer, not a single animal ever strayed or got hurt. When he grew up, Ianikios was drafted into the Imperial Roman army and served admirably. Ianikios continued to pray and fast in secret, and he was well liked by his comrades in arms. He served fearlessly in combat and won the fame and admiration of many, including the emperor. After 25 years as a soldier, despite the emperor's promise of honors and riches, Ianikios asked permission to retire to a monastic life. In the monastery, Ianikios learned to read and write and also memorized 30 of the Psalms by heart. But after 2 years, he yearned for solitude, and he left for the wilderness where he spent his days and nights in prayer. It was at this time he composed a short prayer still used in the office of Compline. The Father is my hope, the Son is my refuge, and the Holy Spirit is my protection. On some occasions, St. Ianikios also left the wilderness retreat to go on pilgrimage. Once, when on a pilgrimage to the church of St. John the Theologian in Ephesus, St. Ianikios stopped to ask for directions and was told that the road to the church was flooded. Not to be discouraged, St. Ianikios followed the road to the bank of the overflowing river, rested until midnight, got up, prayed, and then walked over the river as if he was on dry land. He completed his pilgrimage and returned back to his hermitage. Despite his solitude, St. Ianikios was sought after by many for prayer, which led him to move to various places of solitude until he eventually settled on Mount Olympus, where his prayers and counsel were still highly sought after. He is also credited with performing many miracles, including healing the sick and driving out demons. To grant him some relief from the constant visitors, God granted St. Ianikios the unique ability to become invisible. On 2 occasions, St. Ianikios used this ability to help others, even miraculously granting them the same ability. On one occasion, St. Ianikios found out that the enemy forces had captured and imprisoned several Greeks. Using the gift that God had given him, St. Ianikios walked into the prison, freed his countrymen, and they all walked out right under the noses of the guards, who saw nothing. After 70 years as a holy ascetic, performing many more miracles, St. Ianikios fell asleep in the Lord at the age of 104. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Scenes with the Saints. Join us again next time when we learn more about the lives of these holy men and women.
And welcome back, God with Us Live listeners. Father Deacon Nick Medelski, excited as always to be here with you. Speaking today with Father Deacon Anthony Dragani. And in the first half of the show, we talked about Father Deacon Anthony's journey to the Eastern Catholic Churches, his journey to the diaconate, as well as some resources he's prepared and preparing about the Eastern Catholic Churches. There was a document recently released by a group at the Vatican, as I mentioned before the break, which is part of the reason I invited you on today. In fact, I asked several people, I said, oh man, this document just came out. It's obviously important to us as Eastern Catholics. Who should I ask to come on for an interview? And I asked several different people, and they said, Father Deacon Anthony. Who else would you ask? So
Cool.
set this interview up and excited to talk about that. So without further ado, it's got a very long title. But could you, and it's actually a very long document, it's over 100 pages, but could you kind of give us a thumbnail sketch about what the document is, who put it together, those sorts of things?
Certainly. As you mentioned, it is a long document. It's almost 150 pages long. So it's more like a book than a typical, church document. The name of the document, the full name is The Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality in the Ecumenical Dialogues and the Responses of the Encyclical Ut unum sint. So that's quite a name there. It was
written
of church
by words.
A lot of church words, yes. So we'll just call it the Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality for short. But it was written by a Vatican office congregation called the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity, and they wrote it in collaboration with the Ecumenical Studies Institute of the Angelicum. And the Angelicum is a top theology school in Rome run by the Dominicans. So this dicastery, together with faculty from the Angelicum, put this document together, and they call it a study document. Now, as a study document, that means it presents kind of like a synthesis of developments and of thoughts, but it's not magisterial. It has no authority behind it, but it does lay out kind of a good summary of where we're at, how we got there, and it lays out some proposals for moving forward, which I think are very helpful. So on the whole, I'm positively impressed by the document. It says a lot of things that I've been thinking myself for many years. So kind of seeing that in a Vatican document has been encouraging to me. But where it actually goes, only time will tell.
This is just a list of suggestions in the end, right? Well-researched, well-documented suggestions, but in the end,
yes,
just suggestions, right? So.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of resources in there about products of ecumenical dialogues, various documents that came out of that. But at the end, it is a list of suggestions and proposals, really, that I think are helpful, and I do hope that people follow through with them.
Absolutely. And we'll get to that in a second, kind of the significance of some of these suggestions. But first, I noticed Ut unum sint referred to in the title. What is that? What is that document? What does that mean? Obviously, it's Latin. So maybe we start with what it means, and then what document it's referring to, and why that's important to this document.
So that's a Latin, sentence that means that they may be one. They may be one, and that's a reference to Jesus in the Gospel of John, where he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prays for all of his followers to be one. In other words, the unity of all Christians. And that's a reference, as I mentioned, to Jesus' words in the Gospel of John, but it's also the name of an encyclical written by Pope John Paul II. So Christian unity was very close to the heart of St. John Paul. And in 1995, he issued an encyclical, which is a magisterial church document, Ut unum sint. And in it, he kind of laid out his thoughts on Christian unity and the hope of moving forward. And one of the things he talked about in there is how the papacy, the primacy of Rome, is intended to serve the purpose of Christian unity, that's why it was instituted, and how, almost ironically, it's become one of the major stumbling blocks to Christian unity. So in the document, and again, this came out in 1995, Pope John Paul II made a rather radical suggestion. He said that he invited people to reconsider how the papacy could function in the service of unity. In other words, the way the papacy functions today isn't necessarily how it has to function. It can function differently. So he asked people from other Christian traditions to respond and to offer ways that the papal primacy could be exercised that would serve unity without renouncing anything essential to its mission. So, as I said, this came out in 1995, and in 2020, we had the 25th anniversary. So, in response to the 20th anniversary, the dicastery decided to produce this document and to kind of see where we've moved, where we've come since Ut unum sint in 1995. So Ut unum sint is kind of like the inspiration behind this whole document.
Gotcha. And obviously, as you mentioned, the papacy is one of those hot button topics, I guess you could say, in relations between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Oriental Orthodox, even probably Anglicans, different groups that have kind of a, ultimately are not in communion with the Pope of Rome, and there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah.
Or at least they have their reasons. But what kind of is the significance of this document for kind of moving us closer to communion between the churches, our relationship between the churches?
Certainly. So at the very end, the last section lays out proposals for moving forward. And there are a few key items in there that I think are very, very important to any real progress. The first involves a renewed look at the language used at Vatican I. So as we know at Vatican I, the primacy of Rome was one of the main subjects of discussion, and that's where we get the dogmatic definition of papal infallibility. And beyond papal infallibility, Vatican I also talks about the Pope having universal immediate jurisdiction over every diocese in the world. Now, from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, that is very, very problematic. There are a lot of reservations about that. And in this new document, it talks about the possibility of re-examining the language used in Vatican I and reinterpreting it in light of where we're at today. That means that nothing is going to be thrown out, right? We're not going to throw away Vatican I. We're not going to say that it was false. But at the same time, mysteries of the faith can be approached from different angles. And there are ways of looking at the mysteries that are complementary, not contradictory. Now, the language of Vatican I was very much conditioned by historical circumstances. And that's, again, reiterated in this new document. The Vatican I was very much a product of the historical period in which it was written. And that was during a time in which the church was really struggling with this relationship with various states, especially in Europe. And one of the issues that came up was, does the church have authority over the state? This often manifested itself in struggles over who would appoint bishops, who would tell the church what to do. And at the time, this was a huge issue. The church was really struggling with it in Western Europe. And the solution that it came up with at Vatican I was this definition of papal primacy as having universal immediate jurisdiction. Now, when Eastern Orthodox Christians see that today, they think this was about the Pope trying to claim power, trying to make himself lord over the church. But in reality, it wasn't. The reason that was put in there was to make it very clear that there would always be an authority in the church higher than the state. In other words, there'd always be an office in the church that had power beyond that of any state to manage the affairs of the church. So by declaring that the Pope had universal immediate jurisdiction, what they really were trying to say was that there's always somebody greater than the state in affairs of the church. So it wasn't so much about exalting the Pope as much as it was about protecting the church from state leaders who are trying to control the church in various places. So if you consider that historical circumstance, it makes sense to look at this from a different angle with language that is less conditioned by the time period. When you say the Pope has universal immediate jurisdiction, one way of looking at that is that whatever the situation is, if things are desperate enough, the Pope can intervene. And if you look at the first millennium, there were times in which various bishops and patriarchs in the East did ask the Pope to intervene, and he did intervene. So saying the Pope has the power to intervene when necessary, you could almost reword some of the language in Vatican I to specify that. But I think at the same time, you have to kind of lay down some sense of limits as to when this is going to be used. You can't just say the Pope, whatever he feels like it, can intervene and change things.
Right.
So this document talks about looking at the language and reinterpreting it. Another thing that comes with this too, though, is the language of papal infallibility. Vatican I, defines that the Pope is infallible when he speaks on matters of faith and morals ex cathedra, in his official office. And there's a lot of discussion as to when that actually is. But I think the mistake that's made is talking about the infallibility being concentrated in the Pope, because Vatican I doesn't actually say that. A better way of looking at it is that the infallibility is concentrated in the church. We know the church is infallible. Christ says to Peter, the gates of hell will not triumph against it. And the Pope, in his office of universal primacy, exercises the infallibility of the church in his office, not in his person. And I think that moving the emphasis away from the Pope being infallible to the church being infallible, you can still maintain, the essence of papal infallibility, but the language would put the emphasis where it actually belongs, in my opinion, which is the infallibility of the church rather than the person of the Pope. So I think that's also a change in language we need to consider.
Absolutely. Well, I think that puts a lot of those things into focus. And mentioning Vatican I, we also talk in the Eastern Catholic churches about, there's always been kind of this evolution, I guess, of the understanding of the role of the Pope in regards to us as Eastern Catholics. So I assume then that this document has some sort of impact and significance to us as Eastern Catholics as well.
Huge. And a part of that is it talks about the importance of defining the distinct roles of the Pope. So historically, especially if you look back at the first millennium, the Pope had three distinct roles. First, he is the Bishop of Rome, which means he is the bishop of the Diocese of Rome, and he does what a bishop does there. But secondly, he is the Patriarch of the Latin Church. And as Patriarch of the Latin Church, he has a very much hands-on role in overseeing the affairs of the Latin Church. But then finally, his third role is, a primacy in the universal church. And that is separate. His role of primacy in the universal church is separate from his role as head of the Latin Church, Patriarch of the Latin Church, is separate from his role as Bishop of Rome. So this document talks about clearly defining those roles and how they're different. And that's important because after the schism of 1054, when the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church is split, in many cases, the Pope is head of the universal church and the Pope as Patriarch of the Latin Church, those two roles became very confused because the Pope was the only patriarch left in the larger Catholic Church, right? We had other, Eastern Catholic patriarchs who emerged later on. But because the Pope was effectively the sole patriarch, his role of patriarch and his role as, universal primate became so intertwined that he began behaving in ways that a patriarch would behave towards his own church when dealing with the Eastern Catholic churches. So in many cases, the Pope took on the kind of authority over the Eastern Catholic churches that only a patriarch should have. So looking at that and understanding how the Pope as Patriarch of the Latin Church is different from as Pope from the Universal Church has a lot of implications for us as Eastern Catholics and how we operate as churches.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and that's always been something interesting to research, especially how that understanding has developed over time. And of course, the Second Vatican Council was a huge development in that direction as well, and things have kind of it started to move back in the direction, like you said, of making that distinction between the Pope's primacy and his role as patriarch in the Latin Church, as opposed to the patriarch of our church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, or the patriarch of the Melkite Church, or something like that.
Yes, and the new document, talks about the importance of Vatican II in all of this, because Vatican I was never completed. It was never finished as a council because of historical circumstances. Vatican II is in many ways the completion of Vatican I, and Vatican II really does shift the emphasis in a lot of ways, in ways that are better for the ecumenical landscape. So I think it's important we always understand Vatican I through the lens of Vatican II, with its emphasis upon collegiality.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I guess now we come to kind of the big question, the $1 million question, as sometimes people say. But outside of the papacy, and obviously that's a big issue when we're talking about kind of reconciliation between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. What are some of the other, real obstacles remaining for, returning to communion with each other?
Yes. So at the moment, the situation is very complex. As you said, the main theological obstacle is the role of the papacy. How does the Pope function in a universal church? That's the main theological obstacle. Anything else from a theological perspective is largely smoke and mirrors. I remember asking Callistos Ware about this many years back, and he said that today, honest Orthodox theologians realize that the filioque, for example, is not a problem. The key thing we have to address is the role of the Pope. But beyond that, there are some less tangible problems that are keeping our churches separated. They're not easily packaged and defined as a theological issue, but they're more of practical things. So one of the key issues here, one of the key things that keeps us divided, I believe, is the lack of unity among the Eastern Orthodox themselves. That's a big problem. So as you're aware, and as many of our listeners are aware, in 2018, the Patriarch of Moscow broke communion. He severed communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople. And at the moment, there's effectively a schism within the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the largest Orthodox Church is the Russian Orthodox Church, and it's effectively excommunicated the primate, so to speak, the closest thing that the Orthodox Church has to a pope, which is the ecumenical patriarch, who's seen as the first among equals, who has a primacy of honor. So this makes it very hard to move forward in relations when the body we're trying to connect with is disconnected within itself. That's a big problem that has to be dealt with. But there are others. Another big issue is that at the moment, there is an anti-Western current in some strands of Eastern Orthodoxy. And by that I mean, there are some people who've come to define Orthodoxy as being anti-Western. In their minds, to be truly Orthodox, you must be opposed to everything the West stands for. And if the West says something, you must disagree with it to be truly Orthodox. Now, that's illogical. Just because, the West says something doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. But what's happened is there's almost like a competition within Orthodoxy to see who's the most Orthodox. And in the minds of some people, the most Orthodox person is the one who is most strident in being anti-Western, especially in opposing what they call the heresy of ecumenism. So Orthodox who are very anti-Western, who are opposed to any kind of ecumenism, are sometimes in some circles celebrated as champions of Orthodoxy, whereas those who show any kind of sympathy towards the West or any kind of ecumenical feelings towards the West, those individuals are sometimes publicly condemned as traitors to Orthodoxy. That attitude runs deep in many strands of Orthodoxy today. You can find it in Mount Athos, unfortunately. Many of the monks there define themselves in being anti-Western. Not all, but many do. But you also find this attitude in a lot of the recent converts to Orthodoxy from many of the Protestant churches. Not all of them are like this, thankfully, but there's a large number of former Protestants who became Eastern Orthodox and brought their anti-papal, anti-Catholic attitudes with them, and they've kind of infused that into American Orthodoxy especially. So the anti-Western aspect is strong here, especially on the internet. In real life, I have many Orthodox friends. I have Orthodox priests I hang out with who are my buddies. But on the internet, if I only knew Orthodoxy through the internet, I would think they were some of the meanest, most uncharitable people I ever encountered. Because the loudest Orthodox voices on the internet tend to be the nastiest, least Christian people in my experience. And they tend to be hyper anti-Western, and they reject the West, not just as in the Catholic Church, but they oftentimes reject Western culture as being inherently corrupt. So it's hard to move forward in any kind of ecumenical endeavor with the Eastern Orthodox churches as long as so many Orthodox define Orthodoxy as being anti-Western.
And as you mentioned, that's a good explainer there of what still keeps us apart, because I still encounter people either in person or online who say, I figured out the filioque, that now we can get back together. And like you said, that's not really the main issue there. There's a lot of, like you said, the main theological issue, of course, is the papacy, but then there's a lot of these cultural and kind of social issues that also surround it, which at times can kind of make it feel like an uphill battle in some respects.
Yes.
And so that's when some people ask, why keep trying? And I think that's, I'm not one of those people, but I know some people, they might feel that way. We already have Eastern Catholic churches. If these Orthodox want to become, part of us that way, they can join individually, and that's good enough. We should just be okay. And I feel like that's kind of been the attitude, I think, like, for a lot of our history after the, Orthodox and Catholic worlds split apart. For the most part, unless there was some sort of direct interaction, like in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East, right? It's something that a lot of people don't think about. And okay, they do their thing over there, we do our thing over here, and it works out well enough for the last almost 1,000 years. Why do we have to upset the apple cart by keep trying to work towards return to communion?
We have to keep trying. First of all, because it's the will of Christ. We know that he desired for his followers to be one. And the Eastern Orthodox churches, as well as the Oriental Orthodox churches, they are real churches in the sense that they have the same sacraments that we do. They partake of the same Eucharist that we do. And us being divided makes less and less sense every day, especially in a world that is becoming increasingly hostile to Christianity and to the Christian worldview. So us being separated from each other goes against the will of Christ. But also, I think we need each other. I think Catholicism and Orthodoxy really need each other today more than ever. And part of it is this. On the Catholic side, especially the Western Catholic side, there's been a lot of, confusion in some quarters regarding liturgy and the idea of mystery and reverence and what that means. What's happened is very often in the West, a lot of Catholics have come to look towards Protestant traditions as their inspiration. But many of the Protestant traditions, while they have a lot of positivity, oftentimes, they're lacking a sacramental life, they're lacking a liturgical life. And as a result, in the Roman Catholic Church especially, there's a real hunger that people have for mystery, for reverence, and they search for it. A lot of that can be countered by the emphasis upon mystery and reverence that we find in the East. Now, us as Eastern Catholics, we can be that influence to a certain extent, but we're so small it's hard for us to make an impact. But if the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church were to reunite, that sense of reverence and mystery in the Orthodox world would more easily infuse the Western world. So that would make a huge difference. Also, from a theological perspective, Eastern Christian theology has a lot to offer, especially in its approach to theology, focusing on mystery more so than trying to define everything. There's a lot that the West can benefit from that as well. Years back, I took a course, and the professor made an interesting suggestion, or he raised an interesting possibility, which was this. It's possible that the Protestant Reformation would never have happened if the East and the West were still connected as one church. Because a lot of the issues that led to the Protestant Reformation are things that were naturally corrected by Eastern tendencies. So in many ways, the separation between the Orthodox and the Catholics is what led to the complete chaos of the 16th century that resulted in the further fragmentation of the Western Church into the various Protestant churches. So I think that reconciliation between the East and the West would, in the end, further heal the fragmentation of the West. But beyond that, the Eastern churches, the Eastern Orthodox churches in particular, could really benefit from papal primacy used in an effective, responsible way. And again, the result of the current situation is the Eastern Orthodox Church being divided within itself. And a lot of that goes back to the issue that Vatican I was struggling with, which is the relationship between church and state. Anyone who observes this carefully knows that the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia is really subject to the state. It may not be officially, but in practice it is. I mean, the current Patriarch of Moscow was a KGB agent. He essentially works for Vladimir Putin. It's Putin's church. He has total control over it. That's the kind of thing that Vatican I was trying to curtail. So having an authority in the church who's always greater than the state, such as the Pope, that does offer a certain level of protection against the state seizing control of the church. So having the office of primacy that the Pope offers as a focal point of unity, and also as an authority greater than any state, that is something that in the long run could help the Eastern Orthodox churches. And more Eastern Orthodox theologians, at least, are coming to see that there is a value to that.
Absolutely. And I think that really sums it up well, and it would be a mutually enriching experience, you could say, to get the band back together.
Both sides would benefit tremendously. Yeah, it'd be a huge benefit to both.
Father Deacon Anthony, thank you so much for coming on today to walk us through not only your experiences, personal experiences, but also through this document. I think there's a lot of people who, they put out news articles, they put out quick analyses, the day of that document release, that I think it's good to wait for the dust to settle a little bit and then to kind of discuss it a little more, especially from a lot of the reactions I saw to the document were either from Roman Catholics or from Eastern Orthodox, or, people completely unfamiliar with both. And I think the Eastern Catholic churches kind of offer that, a unique space to understand the development of the role of the papacy in regards to the other churches, right, in communion with Rome.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Father Deacon. I appreciate this opportunity because, like you said, when this document first came out, there were a lot of quick responses. And I saw that in some cases, the people responding, who are either Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, were kind of interpreting the document according to their own agendas. And when you have a document that's 150 pages long, you really have to take some time to process it. You really can't rush into a quick response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, once again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for listening to God with Us Live here. We're always happy to have you listening. Make sure, if you don't yet, to subscribe either in Spotify, YouTube Music. You can also subscribe through Apple, iTunes, Apple Podcasts there. Subscribe there. Or, of course, you can always find us on our website, godwithusonline.org. Or if you type in godwithusradio.org, that'll take you to our page on the God With Us Online website. And you can listen to past episodes there and also send those to a friend. That's always an option as well to help kind of increase the reach of the show and help more people find out about our Eastern Catholic churches. God bless.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of God With Us Live. Make sure to tell a friend or two about us and subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to follow God With Us online on Facebook and Instagram for even more great content about the Eastern Catholic churches. And don't forget to check out all the other great Eastern Catholic podcasts at godwithusradio.org, where faith meets life. God With Us Live is a production of God With Us Radio, hosted, produced, and edited by Nick Modelski. Send us a message at info@godwithusradio.org.